Welcome to The Atypical View. I'm your host, Lauren Florio, a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in autism, ADHD, and broader neurodiversity. As a fellow neurodivergent mind, I'm here to help us learn and spread awareness on all things mental health, as well as help us unlearn harmful stereotypes by providing psychoeducation rooted in research and lived experience rooted in my atypical view. The Atypical View is obviously this podcast, but it's also my private practice where I provide therapy to clients here in California with me and provide neurodiverse coaching to others worldwide. So, without further ado, let's jump into the Atypical View. Hello, welcome or welcome back. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about a very overlooked topic, but a very critical one, which is autistic burnout. When we talk about autism, a lot of attention is given to obviously achieving the diagnosis, masking like we talked about last week, social differences, but autistic burnout is incredibly critical. And I want to note that burnout is definitely a term that can be looked at in other neurodivergent settings, but we are going to focus on the autistic lens today. So burnout is not being tired or maybe just being overworked. I know in the neurotypical setting, I think the term burnout is often referred to as just overworking yourself, bad work-life balance. In the autistic world and mental health world, when we say autistic burnout, we're talking about a profound state of mental and emotional, physical exhaustion, and it can impact every part of a person's life and world. So it often emerges after long periods of masking. Again, we talked about this last week. If you'd like more information on masking, definitely go back and give that a listen if you haven't already. But other aspects are very high demands, the social or societal expectations, maybe the relentless sensory input or social overwhelm, and almost always without sufficient recovery time or really knowing how to support yourself. I think that's a big thing that I see with clients is truly just not knowing how to support their autistic brain. So let's talk about the connection between masking and burnout. So masking, quick little synopsis from last week, it's that conscious or unconscious most of the time effort to hide or suppress our autistic traits in order to blend into neurotypical environments. It is extremely taxing. While it can help individuals navigate social situations or meet societal expectations in the short term, in the long term, masking takes a significant toll over time. Many autistic individuals find themselves depleted after months or years of masking, leading directly into burnout. This link is critical because masking requires enormous cognitive and emotional resources. And when those resources are drained day after day without adequate replenishment, the body and mind eventually hit a breaking point, which obviously autistic burnout is the result. So I think it's important to take a moment to understand the connection of burnout and misdiagnosis. It is often missed by professionals as depression, especially in those who are undiagnosed. So autistic burnout does share a lot of overlaps on the surface with depression. Like it can look like loss of motivation or withdrawing from social activities, maybe like fatigue or some numbness and that dysregulation. Because of these overlapping symptoms, many autistic people are given a depression diagnosis. And if they're undiagnosed with autism, depression and treatment for depression is not going to work for them. And especially when our healthcare professionals aren't trained to recognize the nuances of neurodivergent experiences, this is a problem. I know that things are starting to change, but I did not go to school that long ago, and I literally had like a slide on neurodiversity as a whole. So that is absolutely unacceptable in the realm of education, and we need to make adequate differences in what we're teaching mental health care professionals and many other professionals like police and literally everyone needs to understand neurodiversity, but especially mental health care providers who this is literally their job. So I think there's relevance in explaining some of the differences here. In autistic burnout, the primary driver is overwhelm and exhaustion from external demands, rather than this like core persistent hopelessness that we see in clinical depression. Also, individuals report their autistic traits as becoming more pronounced during burnout, like an increased issue with their sensory sensitivities or increased challenges in communicating. So, this isn't typical in depression. We see differences through behavioral activation, meaning going to the gym or getting coffee with a friend is good advice for someone with depression, but it may worsen symptoms for an autistic person in burnout. There's a great reference here called Misdiagnosis Monday. I believe the website and the blog is called Neurodivergent Insights, and I want to say that the person who runs it is Dr. Neff, Neff. I love their Misdiagnosis Monday segments, and I believe they do a really good breakdown of depression and autistic burnout. So definitely give her a little bit of love if you haven't seen her stuff already. I think that she's a wonderful resource within the community. So definitely check her stuff out. The next connection with burnout here that I think holds some relevancy is the connection to dissociation. Now, this connection is complex, and in an attempt to simplify, I feel like I might lose some of the important points, but I'll do my best here. Burnout, like I said, it's not just being tired, it pushes us into states of such intense stress that it can lead to coping with dissociation. And think about it this way: being present and mindful is literally to engage in our sensory experience, right? When we're being present, one of the ways we encourage people to ground is to use our five senses. Point out in detail what you can see, touch, hear, taste, smell. Whereas to be dissociated is to be disconnected from that state. To be dissociated is to lose connection from our senses. We are less likely to recognize input. And it's not that our brain is reducing those neurons. It's a self-preservation disconnection. I think it's rooted in trauma personally. Dissociation can feel like mentally checking out. It can look like losing chunks of time. One way to understand this is our memory is so deeply connected to our sensory experience. If you smell chocolate chip cookies, it may bring you back to being at grandma's house when you're 6 years old when she used to make cookies for you. We have direct links of memory to our sensory experience. So when we dissociate, it's not unfrequent to lose big gaps in memory and time. Dissociation happens in moments of high trauma, but dissociation also happens in this burnout phase, and it's a way to protect ourselves. So it's this deep disconnection from our own body and emotions. So for many autistic individuals, dissociation becomes a survival strategy when the world becomes too overwhelming to face. If you're overwhelmed by all the sensory input, your brain may cut that off as a way to protect you, which it sounds like a good thing, but in the long run, dissociation can be really harmful. So it's important to recognize this disconnect of being present and grounded and learning to self-regulate in moments of dysregulation. It's really essential for a recovery, and it's a big chunk of what I do with clients who are in burnout. And it's hard because it's extremely hard to intentionally come into your body when you are incredibly overwhelmed and dysregulated. So we have to do that in a safe and slow way. And so it's really about learning to support your nervous system through managing your sensory regulation, accommodating yourself in that way. You have to validate the experience and understand that you deserve the rest. Obviously, it's wonderful to have community support and have people who understand your experience and who can be validating through that as well. And self-advocacy is huge in this, being able to say, this is what I need, and believe it yourself, as well as advocate to those around you. It's key. in making steps towards healing from burnout and healing from dissociation. I'm a really big believer that if you're dissociating in your burnout, you're not going to get out of that burnout without taking care of that dissociation. That is super relevant in the connection, in my opinion. That's also why I'm a huge fan of somatic therapy rather than things like CBT, which no hate to CBT therapists, but there are definitely studies that note that CBT does not work for autistic brains. And it's one of the most common types of therapy. It is like probably the number one most taught and utilized therapy, and it doesn't work for autistic. That is, once again, a whole other issue that I'll have to talk about in a different podcast, and I'd love to go into more detail with. But that's why I'm a big believer of somatics. I think we need to slowly engage with our body and our body awareness in order to heal from that dissociation. I want to be very clear that recovering from burnout is not about pushing yourself harder. It is about creating environments to accommodate yourself where masking isn't required, where sensory needs can be honored, and authentic self-expression is safe. So if you think that you can just force yourself into a routine that you once had that maybe you could tolerate before, and if you just are as effective and productive in XYZ as you maybe once were or would really like to be, that all of this will go away, I'm going to be really honest with you and let you know that I don't think that's going to work for you. If you're autistic and you're in burnout, there's not much research to support that outcome. So I'll just put it that way. So I want to use this time to transition into our next segment, the atypical view, which is me, my atypical view, and my relationship with burnout. I want to give you guys some good news. I have gotten myself out of burnout before. That doesn't mean that I am permanently free and don't risk ending up back in burnout, but I thought this was something that I would never be able to dig myself out of a hole of. I want to share a little bit of my own journey with burnout because it's not something I had the language for at the time that I was experiencing it. Looking back, I definitely realized there were so many times where I internalized being lazy or unmotivated, which wasn't the case, and I think contributed to the voices that I heard about myself and the stories that were told about me and that I internalized. For me, masking was so second nature for so long that I didn't even realize I was doing it. And as I started to understand my autism diagnosis, I couldn't do it anymore. Not in the same way, not without it being extra exhausting and intentional. It used to be unconscious. Becoming conscious was so exhausting, and that slowly trickled into a state of burnout. I also think inherently for me, a big realization moment of where burnout started to shift is when COVID hit and I was forced to be inside. I was regulating in a way and giving time and space and energy to myself. My whole life changed. The amount of acceptance that I had for myself in that time, I reconnected with old interests and was able to spend time in my special interests again. I had copious amount of alone time. I was living alone at the time. My roommate had moved out and I was by myself, and it was really nice. I got a lot of, I could keep the house as quiet or dark as I wanted. All of my needs were able to be met in a way that I hadn't have happened in so long. And I had all of the time in the world to do whatever I wanted. And it was such an authentic experience for me. And going back out into the world, once in COVID, the restrictions started to lift and I had to return to work. It was a huge shock to my system. And all of a sudden, I realized how inauthentic it felt to basically pretend to be okay. And that was a huge transition moment throughout COVID. And that kind of like chunk of time is also as I started to understand my diagnosis. And I went back to school and studied psychology. And in that time, I was working with autistic individuals. And that was part of my kind of eye awakening moment. And it was definitely, even though I didn't know what the word masking was, I recognized that there was an inauthentic shift in how I was going about my day, and I was exhausted. I was so tired, and I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And I felt like I used to be so much more capable and push myself in so many other ways, but it was this like shift of realizing what it felt like to feel good and authentic and safe and not stressed out, shifting back out into the world where I was just sort of white knuckling. It was a terrible experience. But at the same time, it's also what led me into doing so much research throughout my time, both in school, not what I learned in school, but I spent a lot of time while in school researching autism and neurodiversity on my own. I wish I could say that my psychology degree, literally having a master's degree in psychology, is like why I understand neurodiversity. And I'm sure to some degree it contributes, don't get me wrong. But majority of why I feel like I can specialize in neurodiversity and autism specifically is because of how much independent research I have done and how many books I have read and how many people I have talked to, lived experience and all of it. That is not the standard experience of I think the typical person who's going on the path to become a therapist, and that makes me really sad, honestly. I don't exactly remember the overall timeline. I was in therapy a lot for years and things weren't working in the traditional way. I had therapists get frustrated with me that I'm doing everything you're asking me to do. I'm angry now because you're telling me all of these things will make me better because they thought it was depression. And meanwhile, I feel worse. I feel upset that I'm working this hard and I'm not getting any better. And I feel like a failure as a person and a therapy client, and this sucks. I did see one therapist that I really liked pre-autism diagnosis. She did miss my autism diagnosis, but she specialized in trauma. And that was one of the things where I felt like my responses to trauma were improving, but I also felt like all of the work of the depression diagnosis that I had with her, I felt like all of the work that she was having me do was honestly not working and or making me worse and I didn't even realize it. And it was like this frustrating experience where my therapist would be like, "Did you do XYZ homework?" And it was some like behavioral activation that I literally could not pull myself to do because I knew it would make me feel worse. And she'd be like, "Oh, Lauren," and like she really cared about me. I don't think she was being cruel, but she thought I had depression and her treatment for depression was not working. And so I fell into this cycle of like I was a bad therapy client because I didn't want to do the homework. I didn't want to go out and see friends and go be out in sunlight. I was super overwhelmed. I wanted to be in a dark room by myself, like playing video games. And to her, that's like the epitome of what someone who's in depression like does not need, right? People who are depressed, like sunshine is great and time with friends is great and getting out of your house and socializing is a good thing, but that it could be the antithesis for the autistic experience. Now, I'm not trying to say that socializing is not healthy, but over pushing it when your body actually needs that quiet time, that recovery time, is the opposite of what depression treatment would be. So I felt like a failure. I felt like a failure as a person. I felt broken. I felt like I couldn't be fixed. It was so frustrating. And I just got worse. And I stopped seeing her for a handful of reasons. She was a really nice lady, but just missed the mark with the autistic aspect. And then eventually I did get diagnosed, and I didn't really get adequate treatment post being diagnosed, but I spent a lot of time probably like trying to self-experiment and self-treat. And one of the things that I tell my clients is I won't make you do anything that I wasn't willing to do at the time. Not to say that like all of us are going to respond the same, but I do want to be grounded in reality of I lived this experience. If XYZ advice didn't work for me, I'm not going to expect that it's going to work on my clients. So it's not to say that I won't offer advice that I think would work for someone, but I'm trying to be honest about not making clients do what I wouldn't do in that time. Dissociation was huge and has been huge for me. It is one of the things that has probably been harder to battle. I actually feel like dissociation starts to come before the burnout for me. And so I have to fight it off with a stick. And it's really hard because that was actually some of the stuff that I really liked that my therapist that I was talking about at the time. We worked a lot on my dissociation, and I took a lot out of that I think was helpful. Gained some awareness of when I was becoming dissociated, and my partner was a magnificent, wonderful support system. He was able to clock that, hey, like I'm talking to you, you're not here, or I see you on the couch absolutely zoned out and you look eyes glossed over. Let's check in. Are you okay? Which I know not everyone has access to someone who can be so wonderful, but I am incredibly grateful to him. Spotting dissociation, I would argue, is one of the hardest first steps. And so I don't, I think I have dissociated so much of my life. And I think that's why I have a lot of memory issues. I also have a lot of trauma looking back, a lot of it connected to being autistic, some of it not. But the overall experience of dissociation has kept me literally from feeling like I'm living any type of life at all. And something I say over and over again is if our sensory experience is what's connected to memory and being mindful and present, then to be dissociated is essentially to be a living dead, like a walking dead. Because if we're not remembering what we're doing, we're not feeling and experiencing life, we're not stopping and smelling the roses, for lack of a better expression, what are we doing? If we're spending our time dissociated, and maybe it's avoidance and maybe it's coping and maybe whatever, but if we're spending that time totally disconnected from our life and from our world, maybe scrolling on social media, maybe just whatever it is, like that's not living, in my opinion. And I felt that deep in my soul. And to be able to now recognize the dissociation and take the steps to ground myself and regulate myself, I won't pretend that it's not hard as all hell, but it is vital in keeping myself away from burnout. I would love to dive into what aspects of therapy is maybe less effective for autistic individuals and what I think is more effective treatment. And I think that could be a cool episode to dive into something like CBT versus somatics and where the benefit shows up or where the harm shows up, even. So maybe that's talking deeper into what actually works for getting yourself out of burnout and supporting yourself as an autistic brain. But for now, we'll close out my personal story time and transition into our last segment of the day. This is our call to action segment. And I'd love to take a moment to do a call to healing. And healing looks different for every person and every body. Here's a couple of things that you could try this week to see how it feels. I know the typical advice that we hear for depression is go outside, meet a friend, stay busy, be active. That's obviously really harmful when we're in burnout. So instead, let's try some of the opposite. See how it feels to, instead of going out for coffee, maybe set up a FaceTime with a friend from the comfort of your bed. Instead of pushing yourself into a sunny, loud park, maybe close your curtains, turn on some soft lighting, and create a little cozy cocoon where your senses can rest. Instead of trying to socialize more, you could spend some time with your pet, you could watch a comforting show, or you can just sit in stillness. And I would encourage you to do something that feels good and connecting to your interest rather than scroll on social media. You know, I love to doom scroll sometimes, but I also know it's one of the big warning signs for me that the more I'm doom scrolling, the more I'm likely entering some dissociation, like an episode of dissociation in my life. I'm not telling you to don't go on social media, although I'm a big believer in taking a cleanse every once in a while. What I am saying is maybe try something different this week and just see how it feels. How does it feel to read a book or do a craft or play a game? As always, you know yourself best, so if any of this advice doesn't feel fitting to you, that's totally okay. Do what's right for you, and I hope that something today was helpful, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, feel free to share it, subscribe, leave a comment or a review, or send it to someone who might benefit from the psychoeducation, or just need a little reminder that they are not alone. If you are interested in my coaching or therapy services, you can reach out to me directly and connect with me at theatypicalview.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and I hope we can stay connected.